Hello, and a very warm welcome to our webinar, a new chemicals framework that leaves no one behind, a webinar on gender and human rights in the SAICM Beyond 2020. My name is Minu, Hemmati, and I'm happy to be moderating this webinar today for you. I'm a co-founder and associate of the MSP Institute, Multi-Stakeholder Processes for Sustainable Development. The MSP Institute is a small charitable association based in Berlin, Germany, dedicated to supporting high-quality dialogue and collaboration among stakeholders, stakeholder participation, and good governance. We've been working on gender and chemicals since 2017 with support from the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection, and we've been active in the SAICM process, the strategic approach to international chemicals management, since then, and now also in the SPP process, setting up the Science Policy Panel. We are very happy to be organizing this webinar together with Women for Biodiversity, an line of women, grassroots women's organizations and networks advocating for gender justice and women's and girls' empowerment in the UN CBD process, the biodiversity process. Tina Rai, the Director of Women for Biodiversity, will also be speaking today. Similar to the CBD process last year, the SAICM Beyond 2020 is now in the final stages of discussing a new global framework, a framework or instrument or framework instrument. We don't know quite yet what it's going to be called, but it's going to be for the sound management of chemicals and waste. The 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management, SAICM-5, that this process is preparing for, will take place September 25 to 29 in Bonn, Germany this year, and will decide on that future framework of international chemicals and waste management beyond 2020. The weekend before SAICM-5, the Resume Intersessional Process 4th meeting will take place on September 23-24 because we didn't quite finish in Nairobi in March, and participants will then discuss final recommendations to forward to the conference, to SAICM-5. We would like to offer the opportunity today to discuss the gender and human rights aspects in the current co-chair's document, the negotiating document, with our experts, and to consider what is needed to ensure that the new chemicals framework indeed leaves no one behind. If you could see the agenda, we're happy to be joined by some wonderful speakers from different parts of the world. First, my colleague Anna Holthaus, project coordinator at MSP Institute, will give a brief introduction on the current gender and human rights language, so to say, in the main negotiation document. In a panel with 3 distinguished colleagues, we will then hear inputs from David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Raymond, Program Management Officer on Gender at the United Nations Environment Programme, and Tina Rai, the Director of Women for Biodiversity. We also have time reserved for Q&A with participants, and we will be watching the chat and pose questions or comments to speakers. Please don't be shy, and also don't be disappointed if we can't manage to address all questions and comments. Before we close today, we will hear a brief call to action and next steps from Sherika Whitelocke-Ballingsingh on behalf of the informal Women and Gender Group at SAICM. With that, let's get started, and I'd like to hand over to my colleague Anna for the introduction to the topic. Let's go, Anna.
Yes, thank you very much, Minu. I hope you can hear me now. Perfect. I will now give you a brief overview of the gender and human rights language in the main negotiation document for SAICM Beyond 2020. It is a 24-page document called the Intersessional Process Single Consolidated Document. It is still a draft as of the 3rd of March this year from the last plenary of the SAICM IP 4.2 meeting in Nairobi, when the meeting was suspended to be continued in Bonn in September. As Minu said, this document will be further discussed at the resumed IP4 meeting just before SAICM-5. You can find the document on the SAICM web page, and we will post you the link in the chat later. On the right side of my slide here, you can see the table of contents of the document. And along this structure, we will now take a look at gender and human rights language in the document. In the introduction of the document, women are listed as one of the vulnerable and at-risk groups who are disproportionately impacted by exposures to hazardous chemicals and waste. After the introduction, a vision for the new framework or instrument is being presented with no direct reference on gender or human rights. In a third chapter, the scope of the framework is being presented and the text lists the protection of human rights. The fourth chapter of the document is about principles and approaches, and it includes several paragraphs, but the full chapter is still in brackets. Paragraph 17 is explicitly on human rights, and it states that the implementation of the sound management of chemicals and waste contributes to the full enjoyment of human rights and human well-being and dignity. Paragraph 18 is on groups in vulnerable situations or particularly impacted groups and lists children, youth, the elderly, person with disabilities, women, workers, migrants, farmers, people living in poverty, and indigenous peoples and local communities. Paragraph 19 is explicitly on gender equality, and it reads, women are agents of change and are vital to address the issues of chemicals and waste. The instrument or framework advances gender equality through their full and equal participation and gender inclusive approaches in all aspects of the implementation of the new instrument or framework, including in decision-making through the implementation of a gender action plan. And a footnote here indicates that the text on a gender action plan might be placed in another chapter of the document. Chapter 5 is about strategic objectives and targets. And target B3, which is still in brackets, mentions gender and age disaggregated data. Target B5, also in brackets, mentions gender responsive educational training and public awareness programs. A new target BX, and X means here that it is not clear yet which target number it might have in the end. And the target is also in brackets, mentions data disaggregation by age, gender, and region. And target E6, which is also in brackets, mentions identification and strengthening of synergies and linkages to, among others, human rights. Chapter 6 is about mechanism to support implementation, and under section D on enhanced sectoral and stakeholder engagement, paragraph 19 mentions the protection and respect of human rights or human health as a task for industry and the private sector. And chapter 7 is about issues of concern or priority issues for international action, and that does not include a gender and human rights language. Chapter 8 is on capacity building and also does not include any explicit gender or human rights language. In chapter 9 on financial consideration, section B on private sector involvement mentions that the private sector should increase its efforts and contributions to avoid, or where not possible, mitigate the impacts on human rights, but the text is still in brackets. And in chapter 10 on institutional arrangements, paragraph alternative 1 on the Bureau of the International Conference mentions the principle of equitable geographical representation and gender balance, but again, the text is in brackets. And the two last main chapters on taking stock of progress and revising and updating the framework both do not include any gender or human rights related language. Finally, the document contains 2 annexes, and in Annex A, on the issues of concern, impacts on human health, taking into account vulnerable and at-risk groups, especially women and among others, are mentioned as important for the nomination of an issue. And in Annex B on principles and approaches, the annex lists several main international agreements on gender equality and human rights, but the text is still in brackets. So to sum up, we've seen that gender and human rights language are found in various parts of the document. However, the gender and human rights language is mostly in brackets, and section 4 on principles and approaches is central to gender and human rights in this document. Okay, I hope this has given you a first overview. Yeah, in the chat, I will put you later the link to this document and also the link to more information on the SAICM 5 conference. And with that, I hand you back to Minu. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for this overview of what is in the document right now. Mixed picture to me, and certainly loads of brackets that will have to be removed within 2 or 5 days. But let's put that to the side. Anna will, as she said, she will share the link to the document in a minute in the chat. And I also told you in the chat, we will circulate the whole of the PowerPoint presentation after this webinar to all participants. So you can have a look at the overview and the other parts of the presentations as well. So thanks again, Anna, for giving us this overview. We'd like to turn to our experts and the colleagues on the panel now, David Boyd, Raymond Brandis, and Tina Rai. And we'll begin with David Boyd. I'd like to introduce him briefly. Dr. David Boyd is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, 2018 to 2024, and a professor of law, policy, and sustainability at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. David, good morning. We just earlier said you got up really early to be here. Thank you very much for making the effort, and I hope you got enough coffee to get you through this 5 a.m. appointment. We are very happy and honored to welcome you. Since last year, each of us has indeed a new human right, the universal human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And this March, David, you published a report on women and girls and this right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. What are your main findings with regard to chemicals, waste, and pollution? And what would you recommend in order to strengthen human rights and gender equality in international chemicals policies like the new SAICM framework? David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Minu. I'm genuinely delighted to be participating in the meeting today and seeing some familiar faces from work in the past. Friends and colleagues, it's been 75 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stated that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And yet, despite progress towards gender equality in some states, systemic discrimination persists. Discriminatory laws, outdated social cultural norms, and harmful stereotypes continue to restrict the political and economic power of women, girls, and gender diverse persons in every state and every sphere of society. Women comprise 70% of the world's poor. Women do 3 times more unpaid care work than men, and only 16% of government ministers are women. As Minu mentioned, in pioneering resolutions from the Human Rights Council in 2021 and the General Assembly in 2022, the United Nations recognized that everyone has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Both of these resolutions also emphasized the importance of achieving gender equality. The right to a healthy environment includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, a safe climate, and most importantly for our conversation today, a non-toxic environment where people can live, work, study, and play. As demonstrated by their impressive but underappreciated contributions to protecting the environment, women and girls are powerful, transformative agents of change. They must not be viewed as victims, but as equal, indispensable partners and leaders in the transition to a just and sustainable future. The voices of women and girls must be heard, their ideas implemented, and their work rewarded. To facilitate these advances, society must dismantle the beliefs, norms, institutions, and systems that perpetuate gender discrimination, including patriarchy, corporate capitalism, and misguided hierarchical thinking that presents man as the pinnacle of evolution, somehow superior to all other life forms. We know that the planetary environmental crisis is affecting everyone everywhere, but not equally. Women and girls are disproportionately and differentially impacted. It is these gender-based stereotypes, biases, inequalities, and discrimination that exclude women and girls from participating in environmental decision-making and profoundly restrict women and girls' fundamental right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I could talk about the gendered cooking responsibilities that inflict literally millions of premature deaths on women and girls around the world, or the lack of access to clean water that causes the death of approximately 800,000 women and girls every year. But we're focused on chemicals today. And the science is clear that because of economic, social, cultural, and physiological factors, women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable to the adverse health effects of toxic substances. Industrial chemicals, heavy metals, pesticides, and other pollutants cause cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, cancer, and reproductive harms. Among the adverse reproductive impacts of exposure to toxic chemicals are early puberty in adolescent girls, which is linked to breast cancer and other diseases, infertility, poor maternal health, miscarriages, premature birth, low birth weight babies, and birth defects. For example, urban women working as informal waste pickers or working in the informal processing of electronic waste are exposed to dangerous chemicals associated with endocrine disruption and reproductive health problems. Cultural norms also affect the vulnerability of women and girls. For example, women of color are exposed to higher levels of toxic substances, including lead and mercury, as a result of using beauty products such as skin whiteners. Pesticide exposure can influence infant mortality, birth defects, infant and childhood cancer, arrested physical, mental, and reproductive development, and early menopause. Because literacy rates in some states are much lower for women and girls, and agricultural training less accessible, important chemical safety information may be inaccessible, increasing the risks of unintended exposures to pesticides. Another disturbing concern is plastic pollution. In many communities lacking effective waste management programs, women and girls are responsible for disposing of household waste, which often results in exposure to toxic smoke from the open burning of waste-containing plastic. Microplastics are more likely to accumulate in women and are associated with a wide range of adverse health effects. Women and girls also lack equal access to environmental information, and as I mentioned, are often excluded from participation in decision-making, and lack access to justice and effective remedies when their rights are threatened or endangered. Yet women from around the world, especially from Indigenous, Black, and other racially marginalized communities, have an incredible history at the forefront of environmental defense. We know that the participation of women and girls in the design and implementation of environmental policies results in better outcomes. There are positive correlations between women in positions of political authority and lower carbon footprints, higher rates of international treaty ratification, and stronger environmental standards. I know that many of you today are focused on SAICM, a voluntary approach to chemicals management. But if there's one thing you take away from my talk, it is that international human rights law, informed by international environmental law, establishes obligations upon states and responsibilities for businesses to prevent foreseeable human rights violations caused by exposure to toxic chemicals. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women requires states to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women and girls. States must mobilize the maximum available financial and human resources in their gender transformative actions to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And gender transformative means capable of changing the norms and systems that perpetuate gender inequality, including addressing the root causes of gender discrimination. States are obligated to empower women and girls through education, access to information, meaningful and equitable participation, and affordable, timely access to justice. States must provide strong protection for women and girl environmental human rights defenders. So, for a few specific recommendations and actions, states should be reducing ambient air pollution to meet the latest World Health Organization guidelines, prioritizing communities that are enduring today the worst air quality. States should eliminate the use of highly hazardous pesticides, for which there are always safer alternatives. States should strengthen regulations on chemicals that disproportionately harm women and girls. And states should monitor the sex and gender disaggregated impacts of these actions. Chemical management should prioritize women and girls with heightened risks of vulnerability, including those from Indigenous and ethnic minority groups, women and girls with disabilities, older women, women and girls living in poverty, and internally displaced refugee and migrant women and girls. My friends, humanity must create a world that is gender equitable and ecologically sustainable. Neither of these goals can be achieved without the other, and only human rights-based, systemic, and transformative changes can achieve a future where everyone, including every woman, girl, and gender diverse person, enjoys the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is not an option, this is an obligation. And so the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and the rights of women and girls and gender diverse persons must be at the heart of whether it's a framework or an instrument, must be at the heart of what SAICM produces later this year. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues speak and answering your questions.
Thank you very much, David, for this very powerful statement and lots of facts of the numerous dimensions of the harmful consequences of inequality, of gender inequality and other inequalities, as you've mentioned. And I really liked your reference to the misguided hierarchical thinking, as well as to the fact that SAICM might be a voluntary instrument, but there's a whole arena of obligations that states and private sector companies do have to adhere to, and that we shouldn't forget, just because maybe some people feel they're in the SAICM process in a little more comfortable environment. So thank you very much for this very powerful statement. And you see there's a lot of applause in the chat. I'm sure there will be questions to you, David. Thank you. I'd like to go to our next speaker before we do the Q&A after the three. And our next speaker is Raymond Brandes. Welcome, Raymond. Raymond is the Gender Program Management Officer at UNEP headquarters based in Nairobi, Kenya. He has more than 20 years of experience in the development sector and has worked with the UN and with international and national NGOs in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa on organizational and institutional capacity development, gender, and sustainable development. Raymond actually holds a master's in sustainable development and a bachelor in chemistry. How fitting. Raymond, how can or should a new SAICM framework support gender justice and human rights, and what makes a new international framework or framework instrument strong with regard to these issues of gender equality and human rights? We're looking forward to your statement. Over to you, Raymond.
Thank you, Minu, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Welcome, everybody. As Minu said, I work for UNEP, and at UNEP, we look at currently we look at the triple planetary crisis of climate change and biodiversity and pollution and waste. And of course, the latter part is very relevant for today's session. Thank you, David, for explaining a lot about the Human Rights Declaration, where gender is a principle, as well as the right to a clean environment. So I won't go into that. Anna, you put up the presentation. I've tried to come up with some points, especially for reference later, that people can still look at this. So I try to avoid repeating what David already mentioned. That environmental challenges, of course, are disproportionately affecting certain persons. And what I noticed, and why I want to make a kind of a caveat in my statement, is that gender, yes, it's bigger than just the male and female, and that we should recognize the LGBTIQ plus community. But for the simplicity of today's speaking, I may just limit to the dichotomy of male and female, as I will use some terminology in the later slides that may affect to that. As David also said, and you see it on the last point of this slide, that this new international framework really needs to put human rights and gender equality at the center, because that is just obligations that we have already accepted 75 years ago. So that is really where things should head at. But if we go a little bit more on the technological terms for gender, Anna, you can go to the next page. Because we're talking also about the language for this new framework. And nowadays, the terms gender responsive or gender transformative are required actually by most of the donors and other organizations. It's no longer sufficient to do gender sensitive approaches. And I'll explain a little bit the difference of these two terms and how they are important. Yes, we still appreciate very much that activities, interventions are focused on building women's empowerment, but that is often not enough because it doesn't tackle the power dynamics between the two, the male and the female, let alone that there's many other genders. So in terms of gender sensitive, we often accommodate to the one side of the coin. For instance, we empower women by making sure that water is closer to the homes because they are responsible for collecting the water. So we make their life easier, but that doesn't mean we're changing anything in the gender dynamics. Therefore, there are also strategic needs to get away with this subordination. Why not try to get the men to collect water, for instance? And those will be really transformative approaches if we can get to work with men and women and explain the importance of working on these gender power dynamics. That will resolve a lot more and empower the men and women more equitably. Maybe go to the next slide. People can read very much the definitions by themselves. Yes, we look often to women as the victims, as vulnerable groups, as they were also listed in the list of vulnerable groups of the SAICM. But we should also recognize them as agents of change. They have a lot of knowledge that can make a difference. So we really need to engage them as agents of change. And while we are engaging women, we should also keep engaging men, because as I said, gender is about this power relationship between men and women. Now, when you work with women, it doesn't mean you disempower men. Those powers have no plus and minus. When you empower one, it doesn't mean it goes at the expense of somebody else. So we can easily accept that, yes, we can empower women, but we should not forget to engage the men. Often when they are in the positions of power, they need to groom the women then into those power and share those power relations. Women, of course, come in many forms. Indigenous people, we have young girls, we have young women, we have rural women, we have environmental women defenders. So they also can come in from different perspectives, which we refer to often as intersectionality. So they can be discriminated actually in more than one fashion. It is also then important to refer to other international agreements on gender equality. As we just mentioned, actually in the Human Rights Declaration, it's already mentioned as a principle of gender equality. But there are many more international agreements that we can refer to and that we should uphold. Of course, a long time ago, it started with the Beijing Declaration, where actually the word gender mainstreaming was invented, and which is still very applicable nowadays. There are other conventions like CEDAW, which is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Of course, now since a few years, we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 5 is related to gender equality. And every year there are the commissions on the status of women held, where governments and others are coming together to agree in a certain thematic area what they will continue to work on. So there's lots of other international agreements that a relationship could be made to show that, yes, this may be a voluntary one, but there are many others where we have already agreed to that we will uphold and implement them. Yes, as Anna also said, gender has been scarcity put in different parts of this proposal, and even in between brackets, which is silly in my opinion. But yes, gender mainstreaming, as was defined in 1995 in Beijing, needs to be mainstreamed. And that means mainstream, you put it in all the sections where it's relevant. So don't treat gender as a separate issue. When it's then based on a gender analysis, including in chemicals and waste, we can come up with interventions, and the interventions have to lead to certain results. And often we only think about quantitative indicators, the things that we can count. But in this sense, for gender, it's often very much more important to have qualitative indicators, because people should express how an intervention affects them, and we often can't count that unless we talk to them. So qualitative gender indicators are very important as well. Next slide, please. I think it summarizes the next one, yes. I think regardless of the subject that we're talking about, there are 3 areas that usually lead to gender responsive measures that will address gender gaps in any field. We talk about meaningful and equitable participation. That means in implementation as well as in decision making. Equitable access to and control over resources, as well as then the equitable sharing of benefits of the interventions that are taking place. And I think I'll stop there and I'll wait for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raymond, also for making very clear what's the standard in international agreements in terms of language, and some of that I would think is still missing in the new framework instrument in the SAICM Beyond 2020. So I very much appreciate you making that very clear. This is where the standard is, and the informal women and gender at SAICM group also mentioned that in their statements repeatedly. We don't want to fall back to what we already, as compared to what we already have. Thank you also for coining, I think, the term silly brackets. I think in international agreements, there are many different kinds of brackets because you don't agree, brackets because what you want to trade, brackets because you want to annoy people, and so on and so forth. But now we also have silly brackets. So thank you very much.
If I may add,
Sure.
It's something that I come across in my work in UNEP as well. When I review project documents, proposals, that often things related to gender are put in between brackets. And I'm like, why? What is the meaning of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please remove all brackets. Just we can't even speak in brackets. So, or do we do like this, or do we do this? Please.
Yeah,
Thank
please
you.
don't introduce any such practice. People might pick this up. So, but thanks very much. Yeah, let's remove the brackets around the stuff that is really essential and really reflects the standards of language that we actually have in international agreements. So thanks again, Raymond. I'd like to turn to our third speaker and our co-organizer, Tina Rai. Tina is the Director of Women for Biodiversity, an alliance of women, grassroots women, organizations and networks advocating for gender justice and women's and girls' empowerment in the UNCBD, the Biodiversity Convention process. She's been active in that process and the UNCBD Women's Caucus for many years. There's a lot that we can learn from that process for SAICM. So Tina, last year, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, has been adopted with strong language on gender and human rights, also especially thanks to your and the CBD Women's Caucus tireless advocacy work. What is it from your perspective that the SAICM process in its last stretches can learn from the CBD process and its success? So over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Minu. Can everybody hear me clearly? Perfect. It's quite difficult to come after David and Raymond. A lot of the things have been said, but Anna, you have my presentation. So today I just wanted to focus on, like Minu, you talked about some of the learnings or sharings from the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. I always tell people, usually everybody is very familiar with UNFCCC. She's like Miss Universe, in the UNCCD and the CBD kind of gets lost. But there has been some really very good advancements made last year at the the CBD COP. So I wanted to basically share the outcomes of the UNCBD COP 15 that took place actually recently in December last year in Montreal, and its relevance to the discussion that we are having here today, and hopefully to maybe influence the discussion that are going to happen in September later this year. Next slide, please. And I can change the slide, yeah. So basically, I wanted to start off, like I think you talked about, like how SAICM is a voluntary process and how, what is the relevance with gender. So I just wanted to basically bring about, of course, the Rio Convention, which is has got 196 parties to the convention, is that in the work of the CBD, also because understanding that chemicals has quite a interrelated work with biodiversity. Are they talking about the impacts on peoples or the environment? So just to share that in the CBD's context, the preamble of the CBD recognizes the close and traditional dependence of many indigenous and local communities on biological resources. And it's very key important to also know that in the preamble or text of the CBD, it also affirms the full participation of women at all levels of policymaking and implementation of the work of the three pillars of the CBD. Of course, it also talks about the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity for the critical importance of meeting the food, health, and other needs of the growing world population. So having said in the preamble of the CBD, the Rio Convention, it is also the first Rio Convention to have actually and adopted the gender plan of action. So the CBD in 2008 had this plan for having a gender plan of action. And I want to share this because I know it's still in brackets, but SAICM is also thinking about it. So in the CBD, in the COP10, when the AICHA biodiversity targets were adopted, it also, like Raymond talked about mainstreaming, it also talks about mainstreaming gender in the implementation of the plan. But in 2014, in COP12, there was a decision, decision 7, that had adopted the gender plan of action. It was from 2015 to 2020, and the year 2020 being to align with the AICHA biodiversity target. So this started a plan of what or how gender could possibly be mainstreamed in the work of the CBD, including in the implementation of the AICHA targets. However, we saw that over the years when the analysis were done, there weren't many references, concrete references to the roles and contributions of women. And I think they've always been bracketed being vulnerable and being the benefactors and not exactly as agents of change. Next slide, please. And I'll go to the next slide. I'm going to keep it very short. So having said that, one of the key moments for us, like you talked about, was that in COP 14 in 2018, all these years, like you saw, the active biodiversity target was ending in 2020. So the COP 15 was supposed to come up with this new blueprint for biodiversity or nature. I think nature is now everybody seems to have their solutions in nature. So the CBD came up with some ideas and guidelines to what would mold or shape this blueprint for nature. And one of the key elements of the COP 14 in Sharm el-Sheikh was that to ensure that the next global biodiversity framework would be gender responsive. So of course, what happened was that as I said, that the COP 15 only took place last year because of COVID. The COP 15 was delayed by 2 years, meaning that it took 4 years for all of us to come together. Now in that making of it, basically that the AICHA targets were basically going out. They had to come up with new goals and targets. And we really saw this opportunity. And what we did was over the 4 years, we worked with the parties, with allies, with the members of the Women's Caucus, with agencies, to really try to see, to be honest, people thought it was completely not possible, but to have a standalone target embedded into the global biodiversity framework. And I think one need that we saw that was because understanding that there was a gender plan of action, there is a recommendation to the parties to the convention to say that, okay, it has to be mainstreamed, but we really didn't see that there was a lack of that in the real implementation. So we said, okay, fine, let's go to have a standalone target on gender equality. And so over the 2 years, last meeting, we all were in 2020 in February in Rome, where the working group 3 took place. So since then, we had 2 years of gap. And the first meeting that the working group that took place was in March in 2022 in Geneva. And in that time, we really embarked on this campaign saying adopt 22, this 22. So you can see a few of these campaign things we ran out in Geneva. And what really happened was that Geneva was a monumental, strategic, monumental step forward for this target, because until then, it was in brackets. So at least to come up with target 22 on gender equality was in bracket. And we took this up on because Costa Rica was one of the parties who had showed this interest 4 years ago. So we joined parties with them. We work with the GULAG. So you can also see here some of the tweets they did to support. So basically stating in Geneva, we got 38 parties going forward in Nairobi, which took place a couple of months, basically March, April, May, June, in 3 months. We got more party support. And with that, in COP 15, I'm really happy to say that this is a consensus. So I can say that with the consensus of the convention parties, which is 196 parties, you can assure that the target on gender equality was adopted in December last year. Next slide, please. So that was really momentum. And I would also really say this, I think because, a lot of the parties or member states are the similar ones who follow these conventions or these different mechanisms. So I also wanted to share that one thing was that it was not something that we only did by ourselves. I definitely would really try to also acknowledge the parties who really made it forward, because at times these negotiations, you can have a lot of aspirations, but at the end, in the CBD, they're the parties and it has to be something that they support. So also saying that I'm really happy to see a very large growing segment of the parties who supported us to take this an aspiration to be a reality. So at COP15, what we also managed to do was that for the first time ever, the CBD COP15 had a high-level ministerial breakfast on biodiversity and gender. I will say that, like I said, CBD, nobody much follows it, but it was fantastic for us. It's never happened before. So you can see this photograph, they're all ministers. Of course, we need to change this to have more ministers, but we all have women ministerial breakfast we had with them to show, what they'll be doing, what gender responsive is all about. So it was sharing experiences, what parties were doing in their countries. So one of the key outcomes of the COP15, I'm only going to focus on two. One, of course, is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has a vision to live in harmony with nature until 2050, but with actions until 2030. This is a CBD COP decision 15/4. And one of the other outcomes was the post-2020 gender plan for action, building up from the previous one, which is under the COP 15/11. Now, Anna, can you change the slide? So what I will really focus is on, because of time constraints, I'm happy to also share more information, is on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'm really happy to share this because I think when I also looked at the SAICM document, there was a lot of similarity, to be honest, on the way it's being formalized, right? You have the goals and you have 4 goals and you have targets going along with it. So just looking at what the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework has. So in section C, in particularly, it talks about the implementation. In that under 7, and this is with no brackets. So aspiring that SAICM follows this. So you have 7G, which is human rights-based approach, which talks about respecting, protecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights. And the other is the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In the same section C, for the implementation, to ensure implementation, they talked about gender. So they're talking about gender equality, empowerment, and also saying that the framework action should also address reducing inequalities. Next slide, please. So now the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has 23 targets. And so for gender, there are 2 specific targets that specifically mentions it. So one is target 22, which talks about effective representation and participation, access to justice information. And I've highlighted some of this because I also see some of these same terms being used in the SAICM document, though in brackets, but also saying that this particular target also talks about particularly to indigenous peoples, culture, their rights over land and territories, resources, and traditional knowledge, including children and youth, people with disabilities, and very importantly, for the full protection of environmental human rights defenders. So it's the first time ever. I'm really happy to say this was a great outcome of the CBD. And one big win for us, like I was sharing, is target 23. So just for the confusion, until Geneva, it was target 22. Then it got pushed. I'm happy that is the last one, so it's target 23. And now why do I like the placement of it that it was 23 is because target 23, how everybody's referring to right now, is a standalone target within the framework, within the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which particularly focuses saying that the implementation of the framework has to be gender responsive. It needs to be also contributing to the 3 objectives of the convention. And it was a big win for us because we did not have placement of gender in the other targets, but having this objective in this target 23 now will ensure that either when you're talking about conservation, because the 3 pillars of the convention is conservation, sustainable use, access and benefit sharing from genetic resources. So this kind of encompasses the aspiration that we really wanted for the whole convention work and the GBF to be gender responsive. So it also talks about specifically rights and access to land and natural resources. And I also see that some of the recommendations are similar with what David shared and with Raymond shared. Of course, informed participation, leadership, and decision-making to the biodiversity. And this is also a win for us because the way that Target 23 has been proposed is, so I'm not sharing all the other targets, because the way that the Target 23 was also proposed is to ensure that the target should not be looked at by itself, that the Target 23, the elements of it should guide the full 22 targets, whether you're talking about climate change, or you're talking about agriculture, or you're talking about mainstreaming, or you're talking about financing, that any other target that has to be looked together with this particular target, which is Target 23. Next slide, please. And I can move the slides. Now, it's like, why am I bringing the relevance from the CBD to the SAICM? One of the specific target under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is Target 7. The Target 7 talks about the pollution risks. It talks about, I think also like what David talked about is, reducing the overall risk from pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals by at least half, including integrated pest management, taking into account food security and livelihood, and also preventing, reducing, working towards eliminating plastic pollution. This is really very relevant for the work of the SAICM, because though the SAICM is voluntary, the aspiration on a binding, the CBD has this target, which would have to be addressed, I'm guessing going to be in the SAICM. And here it definitely also talks about, giving at least a number saying by half, and this target is set for 2030. So I see a lot of blanks in the SAICM documents on the years XXX. Maybe some of this will be informed to address this particular target. Now, Raymond also talked about indicators. Indicators is a very key element of the CBD that is being proposed, which is under the monitoring framework. And I just wanted to share quickly on the indicators for this one. I won't read everything. You may be more familiar with it than me, but just saying that with one of the key elements that we are really working towards is saying that so basically the headline indicators are global indicators on which the reporting would be assessed for the Global Biodiversity Outlook 6, I'm guessing, but also these are the global indicators. Is to also ensure, I don't know the work of SAICM, because I know there's also work around gender, at least the indicators, and talks about gender indicators, to really ensure how would they also have a gender specific indicator on this target. So I'm just also looking at these cross-fertilization and synergies between these two processes. So I think that's the end of this slide. So I just wanted to share is that the reason why we're trying to make these linkages is because chemicals are everywhere. And I think David really had beautifully talked about the data and the reason behind it. It's in the air we breathe, the food we eat, they affect our health and well-being, but not in the same way for everyone. Women and men have different exposures and vulnerabilities, different roles and responsibilities, and different needs and priorities. So gender does matter in chemical policy because it affects how we are exposed, how we cope, and how we respond, how we benefit, and how we are harmed. So gender matters in chemical discussions because it helps us understand the issues, the challenges and the solutions, the perspectives and the values. So gender matters for a safer world, a world where chemicals are used wisely and safely, a world where everybody is protected, a world where diversity is respected, and also to ensure that women's right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is pursued, including in the chemical discussions. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to share any further inputs. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina, for giving that overview and the history, your strategies, and how you went about it, but also really making those linkages, which I believe will be essential to strengthen maybe the language that we can achieve, but also the implementation of that language after agreements have been reached. So it's really a question of rights and of justice, and all three of you have highlighted that. I feel encouraged, Tina, by the presentation, because you've made clear, you know, that you came from not much to something really significant. And on the other hand, I see that we have 2, 3, 4 negotiating days left, and I'm wondering, what is it that we can expect from ICCM 5? What is it that we can achieve? What is the most powerful achievement that we can get under those circumstances? And maybe that's my personal question or part of the discussion. But anyway, thank you very much also for this presentation. My job as a moderator, of course, is to look at the time a little bit. So I'm wondering if we could open for questions, and I'd like to invite participants to pose brief questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand if you wish, and we can switch off maybe the screen sharing so that we can see a few more of us should people raise their hands. But yeah, I'd like to open it for questions. And maybe while you think about what you can ask these 4 special people and knowledgeable people in terms of how we're going to get forward in the SAICM process and get a good agreement at ICCM 5. I see that Maria, I think a colleague from Mexico, from the Mexican government, you raised your hand. Maria, I'd like to give you the floor. You unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you so much, Minu and Anna, and of course the MSP Institute for organizing this panel, and also all the speakers for their relevant contributions in this discussion. As you know, the Mexican delegation has been working hard during these negotiations within the chemicals cluster to promote the human rights approach, the gender perspective, and gender action plans in all these negotiations. So even when we can think that it is a very elementary topic in terms of gender equality, we have perceived that it is highly contested by a number of countries which still hesitate about its pertinence. Sometimes I think it is based on misinformation, misguidance, and others solely due to geopolitical motivations. So talking about brackets and to remove them during the discussions, we consider this very important to strengthen our efforts and improve our coordination to advancing on the standards and to mainstream gender considerations. For it to be successful, it requires promotion and to have a frank and open and constructive dialogue with all countries and stakeholders, but also a very well coordinated advocacy with other parties. And I have to say that in this topic and in this very special effort, a key element has been the close collaboration with civil society organizations and the UN agencies. So I want to say just that your support has been very crucial to create a better understanding about the concepts and language and that we use in our proposals. So I just want to encourage you to keep this close collaboration with countries that we support. You have allies with to support all the inclusion of these approaches and the gender agenda in the negotiations. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. And it's been indeed, I mean, a great collaboration because I am, during those meetings, so much busy with other things. I kind of see it on the side that Anna and Sherika and others who are active in this space have been working with you and with other countries to try and push this. And of course, with the UN agencies, I believe we're going to need that coordination and push certainly until ICCM 5 is done. At least that would be my expectation. I'm wondering if there are other comments or questions right now. If not, I would like to put our panelists on the spot one more time, and that is in terms of ICCM 5 outcome. If we think about what the text, what the co-chair's summary text, the negotiating text looks like at the moment, what is really missing to make this acceptable by international standard in terms of the language that needs to be there on human rights and gender equality, and what can we expect of ICCM 5? You know, what is it that a minimum or maybe a really good outcome should look like? And if you think about, you know, the kind of time we have left, maybe you can even give some thoughts or guidance on what one might achieve and what we might want to push for. So if it's okay, I'd like to turn to the panel for some thoughts on this, and maybe start with you, David.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Minu. And I think that Tina actually did an outstanding job of drawing the lessons that we could and should learn from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. But as I wrote in the chat, I think it's absolutely critical that whether it's a framework or an instrument, that whatever comes out of this process absolutely fundamentally has to include recognition that everyone has the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is agreed upon language from a General Assembly resolution, from a Human Rights Council resolution. It's in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It was in the Sharm el-Sheikh outcome document at COP27. And SAICM will be a failure from a human rights perspective if this language is missing in action.
Thank you, and what a lovely quote at the end. It will be a failure if this is missing in action. Thank you very much, David. Raymond, any thoughts?
I completely agree with David on that one, because if this is going to be a voluntary one, we have to refer as much as possible to those that we already agreed to, so that people see that this one is actually as serious, whether it's voluntary or not. And then getting back to the gender language, I think we need to make it as strong as possible and make clear what the difference is between being sensitive to something or being transformative. I think that will call to really do something about it, yeah, to make things transformative than to be just sensitive. I do understand the brackets, because certain countries would not want certain language in it. So I do understand that brackets are sometimes necessary to get language in. Yeah, if we can make it as strong as possible, then it really gets somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raymond. Sorry.
I was just going to say, get rid of the silly brackets.
And we can quite easily determine which ones are the silly ones, right? From a human rights and gender equality perspective, there seem to be quite a few. Indeed, thank you very much, Raymond and David, for your thoughts. Tina, what about you? What do you expect, or what can be expected of ICCM 5, given the landscape that we're in right now?
Well, following Raymond and David says, get rid of the silly brackets, because if you look at the language on human rights and gender, it's actually very close to what get adopted in the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. So I think there is like, and there are parties to the convention there, which is more binding. So I think it's the same parties. And I really wanted to also take the opportunity, because I do know that in this meeting, there are also delegates from governments and who will also be there. And this is one way to taking it forward, like I said, is that to have that support. Like we always say that civil society is always there to support with, the research or the information, but also a request for the, I don't know whether you call it member states or delegates to the SAICM, but something that's saying that this is something that you can take forward, especially if the language is very close to the what's got adopted in the GBF. On specifically, I will take this opportunity, like I said, because I see that some of them are here. One really key important element, I think, is looking at how gender is not just something which is, again, aspirational, but rather in concrete actions. Say, for example, for target E is really very important. If you look at, I'm going for textual recommendations, I'm sorry, but it's more like if you're looking at, say, target B5 that Anna talked about, and that's the only one which is in the whole target, which is talking about gender responsive. Once again, in the scope and in the vision and the principles, you're talking about implementation actions, right? But when you're looking at the targets of this particular document, there's only one reference to gender responsive. But once again, this is only about awareness raising and education. But if you're looking at how the roles and contributions could be really taken in forward to deliver the outcomes of the SAICM document, that's completely missing. And I think that, and one key element that I will also really talk about is financing. For some reason, we always seem that stakeholders should contribute voluntary. It doesn't happen. So that is something, I think, a key element that we've also been focusing on is the CBD saying that, okay, you can have voluntary, but you do need support. I mean, like David talked about, the impact, and you're talking about the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable populations. And it's impacting their health, it's impacting their livelihoods, they are having to adapt. But when this comes to resources, there's no allocation at all, but just saying that, okay, we will have educational materials or awareness raising. So I think consciously, we really need to also see that how those kind of elements are much more concretely embedded into the document. And also, like, I think David, looking at the Davis chat, again, once again, because I know people are here, is in the annex, is to see where there are principles and approaches that that apart from the other references to elements or instrument, that of course the global biodiversity framework should be included. But that is a very key decision that took place. But also, of course, the human rights resolution and the General Assembly resolution on the right to a healthy environment should also be listed in that annex to this document. So I will keep it limited to that for now.
Thank you very much. I mean, the beauty or one of the beautiful things, maybe also not always easy to manage in the SAICM process, is that it's not only parties, it's not only member states, it's not only member states and UN agencies, it's all stakeholders and who have the right to contribute and are contributing. That's of course, because it is a voluntary framework, this is possible, but we can even more obviously build alliances and coalitions to clean up the silly brackets, for example, across the different stakeholder groups, countries, UN agencies, and maybe there's also something that could be taken up with the IOMC participating organizations. And we have Raymond here, but maybe it's also a moment to think about drawing in some other UN agencies and programs like CBD Secretariat, like UN Women, like CEDAW, to strengthen that voice in the process in Bonn and towards it. So that's just from the top of my head.
Minu, can I add on something?
Sure.
That's okay. Yeah. Again, sorry. Looking at the discussion when you talked about the stakeholders' engagement. Maybe it is also very relevant to really then look at the scope of the document, where in the introduction, where vulnerable and risk groups are identified as women, right? But when there is a definition in the scope of stakeholders, women are not there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the definition is saying that stakeholders included, but are not limited to, of course, but it says civil society, government, including businesses, are stakeholders. but it does not have reference to women. So this is where because we had to deal with the same thing, because they're like, oh, you all are stakeholders, and then businesses are stakeholders. So it's maybe very important to also have this clarity of where the rights holders are and the stakeholders are. And when you talk about accountability, who has what? And I think maybe then in the document this could be really looked at, because stakeholders does not really mention women.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you very much, Tina. So I think this is an important point in terms of the future of SAICM, to look at what is actually the system of engagement with stakeholders and rights holders in UN processes that relate in the broader sense of sustainable development. We have the major groups, we have other stakeholders that have been added at Rio+20, and SAICM has kind of carved out a different space with a different definition. And it's particularly important here because stakeholders are also part of the governance of the process, as they are represented in the Bureau. But not women and gender or indigenous or youth are not among those. So I think at the moment, looking at the process right now, we're probably overloading it by wanting to add that discussion, but it's something that, in my personal view, needs to be sorted out kind of after ICCM 5. So that also there, we're kind of reaching a standard of where participation and stakeholder engagement is in sustainable development processes internationally. Right, I'm looking at the time, of course, and I was wondering if there's anybody else who would like to raise a question or make a comment from participants' side, either countries or stakeholders or experts or whoever.
Excuse
Yeah.
Dr. Hemmati. In February, I had a talk for the IHPA in Zaragoza about highly hazardous pesticides, especially particularly in developing countries. That's a big problem, you know, and also for women, they are more exposed anyway. And now a group of NGOs, some from EU, maybe some are here also, that are supposed to stop the exportation of these compounds from, in particular from Europe to developing countries. That I'm also involved, but I was late for the visa. I couldn't just for the, not Vienna, the other country, Belgium or Brussels. Anyway, that's a very important issue. Women are more exposed, as I mentioned last year also, in the paddy rice. They have baby in back here in Iran, you know, and many other Asian countries, and they work in the paddy rice with lots of pesticides. And many other, as I mentioned in the chat, biocidal products, cleaning products, they are very exposed. That there are some, I had a talk in Singapore some years ago that they have some overlapping with pesticides, you know, the biocidal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed, for pointing this out. It is a topic of discussion, of course, in the SAICM process. Time and again, HHPs are important and they have been looked at, but I believe there's a lot going on with regard to pushing to make progress on that, and the gender dimensions are indeed, you know, there and proven, including with the publications that you mentioned. And I just wanted to say that maybe the publications and links that have been shared in the chat, we can also share when we put together the documentation of this webinar, so that this is not lost, what different people have put in, including you, Ahmed. Thank you very much. I'm looking at the chat and queue, and I think maybe we can move to Sherika's contribution. No, there's Carla. Carla, I think you get the last question or comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Carla Kraft here, Policy Specialist of Sustainable Development at UN Women. Just want to first thank MSP Institute and Minu and Anu for engaging us and inviting us to this conversation. We really do stand ready. I just want to also thank the speakers, David Boyd and Raymond and Tina, who we've all worked with and corresponded. So just really not much of a question or comment, just want to lend, that we stand ready to support, that this is a really critical importance to UN Women, to women and girls around the world, and gender diverse persons. So just wanted to also thank Tina for bringing in those strategic approaches and those views, and also I think some of you may know that there's a process in the Committee on World Food Security right now going on for voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women's empowerment in the context of food security and nutrition. They're having the last round of negotiations is tomorrow, but I'll come back to you, Minu, but see if there's anything, if we could draw upon on chemicals. Nothing comes to mind, but just wanted to mention that the same kind of bracket, the silly brackets are happening across in all forums. So really grateful to see the coordination going on and the awareness raising to take it outside of the politics and really about the understanding of the real essence of the disproportionate impacts. So that's it for my end, but thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carla, for being here and for underlining and demonstrating the support of UN Women. This is very powerful in this process. So the more attention and the more engagement we see from these leading organizations, the better and the more powerful the message can be. And we'll surely talk about that when we do advocacy again. So thank you very much, Carla, for being here and also making those linkages. And we hope we can build on that and get a good outcome for this agreement, but also for its implementation. We mentioned a few times, so what do we do next? What are the plans until ICCM 5, and how do we want to work? So coming to the end or towards the end of our webinar, I'd like to introduce our colleague Sherika Whitelocke-Ballingsingh from the Informal Women and Gender Group at SAICM. So we call it that because it isn't a recognized constituency, and call on her for a final call for action and next steps. Sherika has been the Poison Information Coordinator for the Caribbean Poison Information Network at the University of Technology in Jamaica for the past 12 years. She has a background in environmental health, medical toxicology, and public health, and she's engaged in the UNEP Women's Major Group and the Informal Group on Women and Gender in SAICM, and she wanted to talk a little bit about next steps and call on all of you to join. Good morning to you again, Sherika. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And as we have sat and listened to the most engaging and informative presentation, I'll just like to reiterate what our three presenters presented. David, he reminded us of the historical journey on the importance of women and gender being a part of the framework. One of the highlights from Raymond's presentation, it's about the qualitative aspect of the gender indicator and the importance of understanding that experience that can bring life to data. And Tina, she brought us back to the understanding and not understanding that when we see women as benefactors and not as agents of change, then there will be a problem. We need to have a gender responsive framework. And in her presentation, she highlighted the linkages within the biodiversity framework. So now how do I put the call for action for all of us, but especially for our governments? Under our principles and approaches, we need to understand the linkages between chemical exposure and waste and women. And we have been seeing this in numerous studies over the years, but there are keen attention that we must focus on. Now, just to highlight 3 specific studies, and it's the reason why I selected these studies. In 2012, Sutton et al. In their published paper, they reminded us that in the past 70 years, there has been a dramatic increase in human exposure to both natural and synthetic chemicals. And today, more than 80,000 chemical substances are listed by the US EPA as manufactured or processed in the United States or imported into the country. Now, approximately 700 new industrial chemicals are introduced each year. And this study was from 2012. Now we are in 2023. What does that say to us today? Toxic chemicals, they're widely distributed throughout our homes, workplaces, and communities. They contaminate our food, water, air, and also they're in our consumers' products. And the need for population database is also called upon in these studies. Now that was in 2012. In 2015, there was another publication in the International Journal of Cancer, and this focused on chemical exposure in the workplace and the relationship with breast cancer. And what was observed were the significant trends in breast cancer cases that were associated with different chemicals that were used in the industry. And from that study, it suggested that additional studies are warranted to examine and to influence the information that looks on breast cancer and the etiology. That's 2015. 2 years after that, there was another paper that was written by Kyung Taek Rim, and this paper, it re-emphasizes that a huge number of chemicals are produced and used in the world, and some of them can have negative effects on both reproductive health of workers. To date, most chemicals and work environments have not been studied for their potential to have damaging effects on persons in specific workplace and on the reproductive health of women. Now, because of this lack of information, many persons, they're not aware of the problems that they're being exposed to on a daily basis. How do we look on the role of women in the change to this process? Now, IPEN had published a document, and it was on women, chemical, and the SDGs. And when we look at this document, it looks at a 2015 evaluation of women's participation and gender consideration in the countries that were represented, and the planning and the reporting to the BRS Convention. And this is what it concluded, that while 91% of the initial Stockholm Convention national implementation plans contain women and or gender keywords, this was in the majority of cases in relation to women as a vulnerable group. Only 30% of these NIPs identified women as stakeholders, and only 8% considered women's engagement and gender consideration as an objective. Now, women can help to promulgate policies and regulation that will add value to public health issues that affect population burdens for health-related diseases, for example, specific to cancer, fertility, child health, and population care program. Why is it important for us to have this as a part of our objective and targets? Now, in 2019, there was another study in the Environmental Health Perspective Commentary that also called for a uniform approach for systematic search, organizing, integrating, and evaluating mechanistic evidence of female reproductive toxicity from various data type, which is lacking. And so we need to have the gender discussion being a part of our targets, being a part of our objectives. Another study spoke to the national priority of promoting and supporting research on occupational cause issues of reproductive toxicity and other public health actions, which include hazard surveillance and primary prevention activities. Now, how do women add to the value of conversation for stakeholders at the discussion table? Women bring to the discussion table scientific knowledge, community knowledge, a holistic perspective on issues concerning women, children, and men in households. Because of their role in all aspects of society, their experiences are at times unique in dealing with the challenges that they face in schools, health facilities, the environment, and as mentioned before, in the home. Without women at the discussion table, all of these opportunities will be lost. The importance of a women gender action plan needs to be reemphasized. In essence, we can all conclude that a gender action plan is needed to foster equitable participation of women in all discussions structured in a national implementation plan, and to create a platform to generate data for continuous tracking to have sustainable programs in achieving the goal for gender inclusiveness.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sherika, for providing even more of the knowledge base that is needed in these discussions and concrete recommendations in terms of the data and the knowledge that we need and the gender action plan that we need. It is referenced at the moment, and we hope we can keep it and then implement it in such a way that it's actually meaningful. So thank you very much, Sherika, for sharing knowledge and thoughts on this. Need to look at the clock though, and we're coming to the close of our webinar. And I would like to wholeheartedly thank you all for your contributions, for being here, for sharing your expertise, for sharing your suggestions. I believe that the group, loosely co-coordinated by Anna, Sherika, Tina, and others who are here, will take up all that has been said and suggested and try to make the best of the remaining time to achieve an outcome that kind of is on par with the international standard that some of you have been sharing here. And we hope that you all come to Bonn to let us get together and remove the silly brackets. I think that would be a really good campaign. Just by way of sharing information, there is another interesting webinar on women's leadership in addressing chemicals and waste, organized by the SAICM Secretariat, UNEP, and IPEN next week on the 21st of June. I believe Anna already shared some of that and put the link in the chat. We ourselves might be organizing another meeting in advance of ICCM 5. Might be good to coordinate some of our activities, not only the ones who are coming to Bonn, but maybe others as well who can help everywhere where you are. I hope, though, to see as many of you as possible in Bonn and supporting this cause so that, yeah, as I said, that we get an outcome that is worth it and that can actually make a difference when we together implement it. With that, thank you again to those who got up early, to those who stayed up late and joined us here. Thank you very much, David, Raymond, Tina, Anna, Sherika, for your contributions and everybody who has joined us. Hope to see you again soon. Take care, be well. Thank you very much.